The American media landscape began its true decline in the 80s under Ronald Reagan's Republican presidency. At the time, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, was supposed to defend the interests of the public over those of the market economy, but through both Republican and Democratic administration reforms of the last 25 years, it has created a consolidation and concentration of the American media into a cluster of fewer than 10 companies.
Once the Reagan administration was done, there were more rules, but they called it deregulation. It's almost this Orwellian use of language where you create new rules, but the rules change because they benefit industry, and you call it deregulation. And you say deregulation, and people feel that's good because people like deregulation. People like fewer rules. But it's a trick. It's not really what's happening.
Media conglomerates now dominate movies, television, radio, music, publishing, and soon, internet. This cartel shapes a large portion of what Americans watch, read, and listen to, both locally and nationally, creating homogeneous opinion and harnessing the public into a culture of consumerism and profit. Progressively and naturally, these companies have renounced their roles as guardians of the balance of power, abandoning information and investigation to advocate a journalism based on sensationalism, patriotism, and speculation.
They couldn't just go in without public support. The public support was created by connecting Saddam Hussein to those fears of terrorism. The fear generated by 9/11, the fear of terrorist networks, has to be transferred to Iraq. That is, the American people have to learn to be as afraid of Saddam Hussein as they are of Osama bin Laden.
Soon after September 11th, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld set up a small intelligence office in the Pentagon, the Office of Special Plans, to create the rationales for the already planned attack on Iraq. She witnessed how the Office of Special Plans issued talking points about Iraq for senior government officials, allegedly based on intelligence.
The information in there drawn from fact. You could find bits and pieces of fact throughout, but framed, articulated, crafted to convince someone of what? Well, of things that weren't true.
The liberation of Iraq is a crucial advance in the campaign against terror. We've removed an ally of Al-Qaeda.
A year later, President Bush himself denies and feigns his surprise. I don't know why everybody thinks that.
We've had no evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved with the September the 11th.
Well, I worked in a place where they concentrated on preparing this storyline and selling it to everyone that they could possibly sell it to.
It wasn't a failure of intelligence, it was the manipulation of intelligence to achieve a political goal.
It's day 4 of the Bush team's full-court press, giving speech after speech after speech and issuing reports.
The United States knows that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
The choice is his, and if he does not disarm, the United States of America will lead a coalition and disarm him in the name of peace.
Out of the same things that were being given to us to put into our superiors, our senior civilian leadership's mouths, these things were not based on intelligence that we saw, that everyone saw. They were based on a very selective reading of the intelligence and then a creative packaging.
Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate.
These guys should be brought up on charges. There should be an investigation about whether these guys should be allowed to serve our country anymore. Because to me, it's criminal to say we're going to send our troops to war based on falsified intelligence, based on puffed up, exaggerated details.
Their policy depends on deception and secrecy, like every imperial policy in history. Even dictatorships have taken great efforts, always to disguise what they're doing and why they're doing it to their own people.
This banalization of information and culture into mere financial markets has brought about the birth of an alternative media, initiated in the 60s and now arriving at a certain maturity. Primarily based in San Francisco, Boston, and New York, this movement broadcasts on a smaller scale network and survives on the benevolence of private support. The broadening forms of communication has allowed a new voice of protest in the United States. On its own scale, this movement plays a crucial role in the revitalization of both information and a conscientious, critical mindset for the American people. It has given voice to public opinion and fostered ordinary citizens' participation in society. Through documentaries, radio and television shows, newspapers, internet postings, online petitions, and weblogs, alternative media has become the spokesperson for an American spirit often absent in mainstream media. Recently, this counter-movement has focused on two immediate threats to its own ideals, that is, the reality and complexity of the war in Iraq, but also the harmful effects of commercial media on news and democracy.
"15 years ago, 50 companies ran the media. Today, 5 to 7. So there's more concentration, fewer people with more power and more control. And they tend to think alike. So even if they're competitors, even if they're competing with each other, they tend to compete by similarity, by uniformity, by homogeneity, by sounding alike and looking alike, rather than by being different. So the viewer or the consumer gets fewer real choices.
NBC, CBS, ABC, they're using the national treasure that is the communications highway, the airwaves of this country. And they have a responsibility to bring out the full diversity of views. They haven't. The media has reached an all-time low in this country, both the networks as well as the newspapers.
Many people in our media are kind of prisoners of it also, prisoners of a certain mindset, a certain way of looking at the world, which tends to often be in sync with the people in power.
There is a reason why our profession, journalism, is the only one explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution, because we're supposed to be the check and balance on government. We're supposed to be the exception to the rulers. We're not supposed to be a megaphone for those in power. And that's what the corporate media has become.
I've watched the news divisions make a substantial and fundamental shift. And the great shift was as they became parts of large corporations and needed to fulfill their role as profit centers, rather than being a public interest service that was part of a commercial broadcasting license. Those network news divisions had to run at a profit. And so in order to do that, the question that the editors and the producers asked changed from what should we do that we think is important, what should we report that we think it's important for our audience to know, to what do we think our audience wants to see. And in making that change, in changing that question, they lost their souls.
I think we're in what's called a post-journalism era, where the values of journalism are not really respected very much, increasingly disrespected. Journalists are not given large budgets to do investigations. Bureaus around the world have been closed, and there's less coverage of the world at a time when globalization has grown in power and importance.
The nature of commercial television, which is that it's an hour that's broken up into a series of blocks that are really about delivering an audience to a set of advertising, to commercials. It's very hard to sustain anything that is a continuing intellectual narrative. You were broken all the time by the commercials that arrive, that interrupt.
The subtext of everything on our commercial media is shut up and shop. Become a spectator. Don't raise too many questions. Don't interact with the media, with political life. Be a subject of society, not an activist in society. Don't be a citizen, but be a consumer. So consumption is the driving quality, and most television stations are in the business of selling eyeballs to advertisers.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling feedback loop.